In the spring of 1943, the SS John W. Brown, a Liberty ship forged in the frenetic shipyards of Baltimore, docked at Norfolk, Virginia, its holds packed with an extraordinary cargo: 2,000 German prisoners of war, battle-hardened veterans of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, captured after the Axis collapse in Tunisia. Among them was Obergefreiter Karl Weber, a 24-year-old mechanic from Dresden, whose weathered hands clutched a tattered notebook, its pages filled with secret scribbles written under flickering lantern light in North African camps. In one entry, scrawled with the defiance of a man steeped in Nazi ideology, he wrote, "The Americans are fools. They claim to feed their people like kings while fighting a war on two fronts. It's propaganda, nothing more." Like his comrades, Weber had been fed a steady diet of Nazi rhetoric since boyhood. America was a land of decadence, its people soft and indulgent, its resources stretched to the breaking point by the demands of global conflict. The idea that Americans could produce food in abundance while arming vast armies and navies was absurd to men who had survived on moldy bread, watery lentil soup, and the occasional tin of rancid sardines in the deserts of North Africa. Yet, as these prisoners stepped onto American soil, they were about to encounter a reality that would shatter their worldview. The food they dismissed as exaggerated propaganda would become the most potent weapon in America's arsenal, not merely nourishing their bodies, but dismantling the Nazi ideology that had defined their lives. Over the next 2 years, the simple act of eating in American prison camps, plates heaped with hamburgers, fried chicken, fresh milk, and warm apple pie, would transform these soldiers of the Third Reich into reluctant admirers of a nation they had been taught to despise. This is the story of how American abundance, embodied in the relentless bounty of its mess halls, rewrote the beliefs of German POWs and sowed the seeds for a post-war reconciliation that would help rebuild a democratic Germany and reshape the world. The journey to this transformation began in the sun-scorched port of Oran, Algeria, where the prisoners were herded into sprawling temporary camps after their surrender in May 1943. The fall of Tunis had been a devastating blow to the Axis, with over 250,000 German and Italian troops captured in a single campaign, the largest surrender of the war thus far. Exhausted, malnourished, and expecting brutal treatment, the prisoners braced for hardship. Instead, they encountered a bewildering display of American organizational prowess. The U.S. Army, with its seemingly endless supply of personnel, equipment, and paperwork, processed thousands of men daily. Each prisoner was photographed, fingerprinted, medically examined, and handed a booklet outlining their rights under the Geneva Convention, an international agreement many Germans had been told was a myth. The efficiency was staggering, a stark contrast to the chaotic supply lines of the Afrika Korps, where food and ammunition often arrived late or not at all. The first true shock came at mealtime. In Oran's dusty holding camps, the prisoners were directed to long tables where American soldiers, their uniforms crisp despite the heat, served food that seemed like a hallucination. Feldwebel Hans Müller, a panzer driver from Stuttgart who had spent months subsisting on 200 grams of stale bread and a thin broth in the desert, wrote in a letter home, smuggled through the Red Cross, "They gave us white bread, so soft it crumbled in your hands, real butter, and coffee. Actual coffee, not the bitter ersatz of roasted acorns we'd drunk for years. We thought it was a trick, a one-time show to make us compliant before the real suffering began." The prisoners exchanged skeptical glances, their laughter tinged with unease. In Germany, civilians were rationed to 1,400 calories a day, their bread often mixed with sawdust or potato starch to stretch supplies. In North Africa, meals were even bleaker: a handful of lentils or barley boiled into a watery gruel, sometimes supplemented by a scrap of spoiled meat. The idea that this feast was standard fare, not just for American soldiers but for prisoners, was unthinkable. Propaganda, they muttered, certain the Americans would soon reveal their true, harsher intentions. The transatlantic voyage aboard the Liberty ships deepened their disbelief. These vessels, like the SS John W. Brown, were marvels of American industrial might. Built to be functional and fast, Liberty ships were churned out at an astonishing rate. 2,710 ships launched between 1941 and 1945, sometimes 3 per day across 18 shipyards. The John W. Brown itself had been constructed in just 41 days at Baltimore's Bethlehem Fairfield shipyard, a feat that stunned prisoners accustomed to the meticulous months-long production of German U-boats. Unteroffizier Franz Becker, a baker from Munich who had once prided himself on Germany's engineering superiority, scribbled in his diary, "They build ships faster than we build tanks. Their factories never stop. How can they do this?" The answer lay in America's standardized designs and assembly line techniques, but to the prisoners, it seemed like sorcery. Aboard the ship, the Germans were housed in clean if cramped holds with bunks, blankets, and even rudimentary medical care, luxuries compared to the lice-infested tents of North Africa. But it was the food that left them reeling. 3 meals a day were served with clockwork precision: breakfast of oatmeal, scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee, lunch of canned ham, mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh rolls, and dinner featuring roast beef, carrots, peas, and, astonishingly, dessert, chocolate cake topped with sugar icing. Becker noted, "They served us cake, actual cake, with sugar we hadn't tasted since 1939. In Germany, sugar is rationed to a teaspoon a day for civilians, if they're lucky. We mocked it, saying their supplies would run out in days. We were wrong." The ship's crew, with a casualness that baffled the prisoners, tossed uneaten food overboard, not out of cruelty, but because their stores seemed inexhaustible. To men who had lived under Germany's draconian rationing, where every scrap was hoarded, this waste was both infuriating and incomprehensible. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Klein, a wiry infantryman from Cologne, whispered to his bunkmate, "They're trying to break us with this. No one has this much food." The prisoners spent their days on deck, watching the endless Atlantic and debating among themselves. Some, like Lieutenant Wilhelm Schmidt, a young officer from Berlin, clung to their indoctrination, insisting this abundance was a staged performance. "They're showing us their best to humiliate us," he told his comrades, echoing Nazi propaganda that painted America as a land of shallow excess. Others, like Gefreiter Otto Klein, a farmer's son from Bavaria, began to waver. After a dinner of roast chicken and apple cobbler, Otto wrote in a letter to his sister, "The food is real. The portions are huge. If this is propaganda, it's the kind you can taste. How do they do this while fighting a war?" Upon docking in Norfolk, the prisoners were loaded onto Pullman trains for the journey to camps scattered across America's heartland: Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Arkansas, and beyond. They expected cramped, dehumanizing boxcars like those used to transport troops across Europe. Instead, they found themselves in cushioned coaches with wide windows and, to their astonishment, dining cars staffed by cheerful attendants. As the trains rolled through Virginia's rolling hills, past the tobacco fields of North Carolina, and into the vast plains of the Midwest, the prisoners stared out at a landscape that defied their expectations. Small-town America unfolded before them, diners aglow with electric lights, their neon signs advertising hot coffee and fresh pie, roadside stands piled high with apples, oranges, potatoes, and corn, and train stations where vendors hawked hot dogs, hamburgers, Coca-Cola, and candy bars. Lieutenant Schmidt wrote in a letter, "We passed a market with oranges stacked like cannonballs. In Germany, an orange is a Christmas luxury reserved for the wealthy or party officials. Here, children ate them like apples, tossing the peels into the grass without a thought. The dining car meals were another revelation. Breakfast included pancakes dripping with maple syrup, bacon, eggs, and fresh milk. Lunch offered ham sandwiches, potato salad, and fruit. Dinner brought roast pork, green beans, and peach cobbler." The prisoners, still clinging to their skepticism, whispered among themselves, insisting this was a carefully orchestrated show. "They've set this up to break our spirits," one prisoner muttered. "No country can have this much while fighting a war." Yet the evidence was relentless. At every stop, the train passed grocery stores with shelves stocked to overflowing, farms with silos bursting with grain, and families driving cars loaded with groceries. Gefreiter Klaus Schmidt, a former factory worker from Dusseldorf, wrote in his journal, I saw a boy, no older than 10, eating an ice cream cone at a station. In Germany, ice cream is a memory from before the war. Here, it's a child's snack. The trains delivered Weber and his comrades to Camp Hearn, Texas, one of over 500 POW camps built across the United States to house 425,871 Axis prisoners during the war. Constructed in just 90 days in 1942, Camp Hearn was a testament to American speed and scale. 4,000 prisoners lived in orderly rows of barracks, each equipped with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and even screened windows to keep out mosquitoes, luxuries most Germans hadn't known even as civilians before the war. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, but the atmosphere was far from oppressive. American guards, many of them young men from nearby towns, treated the prisoners with a professionalism that bordered on friendliness, offering cigarettes and small talk. This humane treatment baffled the Germans, who had been taught to expect cruelty from their captors. The mess hall at Camp Hearn delivered the most profound shock. Breakfast included scrambled eggs, bacon, sausage, toast with butter and strawberry jam, fresh milk, and coffee with real sugar. Lunch offered meatloaf, mashed potatoes with gravy, peas, cornbread, and sliced apples. Dinner brought roast chicken, glazed carrots, green beans, and apple pie, topped with whipped cream or ice cream. The prisoners, accustomed to starvation rations in North Africa, stood in stunned silence as they received their trays, their eyes widening at the portions. Otto Klein wrote, "We thought they were mocking us with this food. How could they have so much while fighting a war on two fronts?" In Germany, my family survives on turnips, black bread, and ersatz coffee. Here, we eat better than our generals did in Berlin. The scale of the food was staggering. Each prisoner received 3,200 calories per day, more than double the 1,400-calorie ration of German civilians, who often supplemented their diets with foraged nettles or potato peels. The camp's kitchen was a technological marvel. Gas ranges, walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, and industrial ovens churned out meals for thousands with assembly line precision. Unteroffizier Paul Fischer, a wiry Berliner assigned to kitchen duty, was astounded by the operation. "We threw away leftovers, perfectly good meat, bread, vegetables," he wrote in his journal. In Germany, people would fight in the streets over scraps like these. The Americans didn't care. They had more, always more. Fisher and his comrades began to calculate one camp's weekly food supply, hundreds of pounds of beef, thousands of loaves of bread, gallons of milk, could feed a German town of 10,000 for a month. The numbers were undeniable, yet they defied everything the prisoners had been taught. The food wasn't just plentiful, it was diverse and exotic. The prisoners tasted dishes they had never imagined. Hamburgers slathered with ketchup and mustard, served on soft white buns with pickles and onions, fried chicken with crispy golden skin, corn on the cob dripping with butter, and ice cream in flavors like vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from Hamburg who prided himself on his scientific skepticism, wrote in a letter to his wife, "The first time I ate ice cream, I thought it was a prank. It was cold, sweet, creamy, like eating a cloud. They served it weekly as if it were nothing. How do they produce this in such quantities?" For men raised on Nazi propaganda about America's cultural inferiority, these meals were a revelation. The food wasn't just sustenance, it was a symbol of industrial might. The milk came from dairies producing 20 million gallons annually, powered by automated milking machines that could handle 100 cows an hour. The beef came from stockyards in Chicago and Kansas City, processing 10,000 cattle a day. The wheat for their bread came from Kansas fields, harvested by combines that could reap 100 acres in a day, work that would have taken weeks of backbreaking labor in Germany. Under labor programs designed to address wartime shortages, many prisoners were sent to work in American fields, orchards, and factories, earning 80 cents a day in credits for their labor. These assignments offered an intimate glimpse into the machinery behind America's abundance. In Nebraska, Gefreiter Heinrich Vogel, a farmer's son from Saxony, worked alongside a local farmer harvesting wheat. He watched in awe as a single John Deere tractor, its engine roaring, plowed more land in an hour than his entire village could in a week with horse-drawn plows. The farmer, a middle-aged man named John Larson, owned 2 trucks, a car, a tractor, and a refrigerator stocked with milk, butter, eggs, and meat. Vogel wrote in his diary, he ate steak for lunch right there in the field, cooked on a portable grill. We got sandwiches, ham, cheese, and lettuce, thicker than our weekly meat ration back home. This wasn't propaganda. This was his life, every day. In California's San Joaquin Valley, prisoners picked peaches in orchards that stretched to the horizon, their branches sagging with fruit. They were stunned to see workers discard peaches for minor blemishes, fruit that would have been a treasure in Germany, where hunger had become a daily reality for millions. Obergefreiter Klaus Schmidt, who worked in a canning factory in Fresno, marveled at the conveyor belts that processed thousands of cans per hour, each filled with peaches, tomatoes, or green beans destined for American tables, Allied troops, or even Lend-Lease shipments to Britain and the Soviet Union. In Germany, we rationed every tin, he wrote. Here, they produce so much they send it across oceans to their allies. The prisoners began to grasp the scale of American agriculture: 30 million acres of wheat, 80 million head of cattle, 15 million pigs, and orchards producing 50 million bushels of fruit annually. This wasn't the work of a decadent nation. It was the output of a colossus, fueled by innovation, mechanization, and a free market. The prisoners also worked in cotton fields in Texas, lumber mills in Oregon, and factories in Ohio, where they saw firsthand the industrial might that supported America's war effort. In Dayton, Unteroffizier Hans Werner, a former machinist, worked in a plant producing aircraft parts. He was stunned by the assembly lines, where workers, many of them women, assembled components with a speed and precision that dwarfed Germany's factories. They produce everything: planes, tanks, ships, and food, faster than we ever could, he wrote, and they do it without fear, without Gestapo watching their every move. These experiences chipped away at the Nazi narrative of American weakness, replacing it with a grudging respect for a system that thrived on freedom and ingenuity. The psychological impact of this abundance was profound. The prisoners had laughed at American food as a myth, a propaganda trick to undermine their resolve. But tasting it, day after day, meal after meal, forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Nazi propaganda had promised a 1,000-year Reich built on conquest and sacrifice. Yet here was a nation feeding its enemies better than Germany fed its own soldiers or civilians. Hauptmann Friedrich Müller, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, wrote in his diary, "Every meal is an argument against everything we were told. They don't need to conquer land to feed their people, their farms, their factories, their machines. They produce enough for the world. We were lied to, and the proof is on our plates." The food became a gateway to broader revelations. Under the Geneva Convention, the U.S. Army offered prisoners access to educational programs, including English classes, history lectures, and agricultural training. At Camp Hearn, prisoners read American newspapers like the New York Times and the Saturday Evening Post, which reported not only victories but also domestic debates, labor strikes, and criticisms of the government, a level of openness unthinkable in Nazi Germany, where dissent meant a one-way trip to Dachau. They watched Hollywood films like The Grapes of Wrath and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, stunned by a nation confident enough to show its flaws to its enemies. Camp newspapers like Der Ruf at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, and Die Brücke at Camp Alva, Oklahoma, became forums for prisoners to debate Germany's future, with some openly questioning the Führer's vision for the first time. By 1945, over 40,000 prisoners were enrolled in courses, learning about democracy, free markets, and the agricultural innovations that fueled America's abundance. Dr. Wilhelm Braun, a physicist from Leipzig, attended a lecture on American farming techniques, crop rotation, mechanized harvesting, and soil management, and wrote, "They shared knowledge freely, like it was as plentiful as their food. In Germany, we hoarded science like a weapon. Here, it's a gift to anyone who asks." The prisoners also interacted with American civilians, who often treated them with a kindness that defied Nazi stereotypes. In Concordia, Kansas, a local farmer's wife named Margaret Thompson invited a group of prisoners to her home for a Sunday dinner of roast beef, mashed potatoes, and homemade biscuits. They were shy at first, like they didn't trust me, she later recalled. But when they saw the food, their eyes lit up. One of them, a young man named Hans, ate 3 helpings of pie and thanked me in broken English. These encounters, repeated across the country, humanized the prisoners and challenged their preconceptions about Americans as greedy materialists. The turning point for many prisoners came during Christmas 1944, a moment that crystallized America's bewildering generosity. Across the 500 POW camps, American communities sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners, parcels filled with cigarettes, candy, books, wool socks, and homemade cookies baked by local women. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, prisoners sat down to a feast that seemed like a dream. Roast turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, and pumpkin pie topped with whipped cream. Obergefreiter Klaus Schmidt, who had grown up in a working-class family in Düsseldorf, recalled the meal in a letter home. "We ate until we couldn't move. In Germany, my family hadn't seen meat in months, and sugar was a memory from before the war. Here, we were enemies, yet they gave us a king's banquet." Local churches sang carols in German, Stille Nacht and O Tannenbaum, their voices drifting through the barbed wire. Boy Scouts delivered handmade cards, some signed with messages like "Peace to you" and "Merry Christmas from Kansas." For men raised on propaganda that painted Americans as godless materialists, this kindness was a psychological earthquake. Lieutenant Hans Werner, a former U-boat officer, wrote, "They treat us not as monsters, but as men." This is a strength we never understood. The Christmas gestures weren't limited to Concordia. In Alva, Oklahoma, prisoners received phonograph records of German classical music, Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, to play in their barracks. In Starka, Florida, a local women's club organized a Christmas pageant, with children performing for the prisoners. In Camp Hearn, a group of prisoners was invited to a nearby church, where they joined American families in singing hymns and sharing hot cider. Obergefreiter Johann Becker, a former schoolteacher from Hanover, wrote, "I sat next to an American woman who handed me a cookie she'd baked herself. She smiled and said, 'Frohe Weihnachten.' I didn't know what to feel. Shame, gratitude, confusion. We were their enemies, yet they treated us like guests. These acts, small in isolation but overwhelming in their consistency, shattered the Nazi myth of American weakness. The prisoners began to see America not as a land of decadence, but as a society built on a radical idea that even enemies deserved dignity." For some, the Christmas of 1944 marked the moment they began to question the ideology that had driven them to war. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a tank gunner from Bremen, wrote, "We mocked their food, their kindness, their abundance. But this Christmas, I saw the truth. They have something we never had, a belief in humanity, even for us." By early 1945, as news of Germany's collapse filtered into the camps, the prisoners faced a deeper reckoning. Newsreels shown in camp theaters revealed the horrors of liberated concentration camps, emaciated survivors, mass graves, and the machinery of genocide. For many prisoners, these images were a brutal confrontation with the moral bankruptcy of the regime they had served. The food they had once mocked now stood in stark contrast to the starvation and suffering in Europe. In Germany, civilians were reduced to eating grass and boiling shoe leather. In the camps, prisoners received 3,200 calories a day, including luxuries like ice cream and fresh fruit. Krebs wrote in his journal, "We laughed at their hamburgers, their ice cream, their endless bread. But they fed us while our leaders let millions die. We were the fools, not them." The abundance of American food became a symbol of a broader truth. A free society, built on innovation, cooperation, and trust, could achieve what a totalitarian state could not. The prisoners had tasted freedom in every bite, freedom from want, freedom to create, freedom to share. For men like Obergefreiter Karl Weber, the notebook that once held his scornful dismissals of America began to fill with different thoughts. "This country is not what we were told," he wrote in March 1945. "They have strength we never imagined, not just in their machines, but in their ideas. They feed us because they can, and because they believe it's right. By 1946, as the war ended and the repatriation of 371,683 German POWs began, the prisoners carried more than memories back to Europe. They brought lessons of a society that produced enough to feed its enemies with dignity, a society that valued openness over control and innovation over coercion. Many became advocates for democracy in West Germany's reconstruction. Hans Kroll, a former prisoner who later became a diplomat, wrote in his memoirs, "The taste of American food stayed with me. Not just the flavor, but what it meant, a society that creates, not destroys." Others, like agronomist Eduard Ackermann, applied American farming techniques, crop rotation, mechanized harvesting, and soil management to rebuild German agriculture, contributing to the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950s. Ackermann, who had worked in Nebraska's wheat fields, introduced combine harvesters to his village, increasing yields tenfold and helping feed a starving nation. The statistics underscore the scale of this transformation. Of the 425,871 Axis POWs held in the U.S., 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent in post-war surveys conducted by the International Red Cross. Only 2,222 attempted escape, a mere 0.6%, and none succeeded permanently, a testament to the conditions that made escape seem less appealing than staying. Surveys conducted in 1946 showed that 74% of former POWs believed their captivity had changed their worldview, with 61% expressing interest in democratic ideals. Thousands maintained correspondence with American families who had sent them Christmas packages, invited them to their homes, or worked alongside them in fields and factories. In the 1950s, over 5,000 former prisoners immigrated to the United States, many settling in the rural communities where they had once been captives, drawn by the promise of the abundance they had witnessed. The impact extended beyond the prisoners themselves. In West Germany, former POWs shared their experiences in schools, churches, and community halls, challenging the lingering remnants of Nazi ideology. Dr. Wilhelm Braun, the physicist who had marveled at American openness, became a professor in Heidelberg, teaching students about the power of shared knowledge in democratic institutions. "I learned more from a hamburger in Texas than from years of lectures in Berlin," he told his students. "America showed me that a nation's strength lies in its ability to lift everyone, even its enemies." In 1985, at a reunion in Austin, Texas, former prisoner Hans Weber, now a doctor living in Maine, stood before a crowd of Americans and Germans, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "We mocked your food, your hamburgers, your ice cream, your endless generosity, thinking it was all lies," he said. "But every bite taught us something about your country, your strength, your humanity, your freedom. We came as enemies, but we left as students of a better world." The room erupted in applause, a testament to a victory won not with bullets or bombs, but with abundance, not with propaganda, but with truth. Among the audience were former guards, local families who had sent Christmas packages, and even a few Boy Scouts, now grown, who had delivered cards to the prisoners 4 decades earlier. Their presence underscored the enduring bonds forged through simple acts of kindness. The German POWs who tasted American food didn't just eat, they were fed a new perspective. Their journey from mockery to awe proved that America's greatest weapon was its ability to create, to share, and to transform. In the simple act of serving a meal, hamburgers, fried chicken, milk, apple pie, America showed what a free society could achieve, turning enemies into allies and planting the seeds for a democratic Germany. The food they once laughed at became the flavor of a new world, a world where abundance and humanity could triumph over hatred and scarcity.